The Subcommittee on State Foreign Operations and Related Programs will come to order. Secretary Mnuchin, thank you so much for joining us today. The administration's FY2021 budget request, which proposes unsustainable cuts of nearly 20% for foreign assistance. It demonstrates once again that the administration just does not value the impact of the global economy on our national security, nor does it recognize the merits of poverty reduction through multilateral development. Fortunately, this committee does. The Treasury Department's international programs are central to achieving strategic objectives overseas. Investing in these areas and our multilateral partners builds resilience and promotes stability that is essential to American interests. The administration's repeated attempts to end cooperation with multilateral organizations threatens our economic and national security and weakens our global influence and credibility. This creates opportunities for other countries such as Russia and China to further encroach into areas where we have chosen to diminish our leadership on the world stage. As they continue to expand their reach, they will not represent American values or interests. With the effects of climate change increasing, I'm worried about the message we send to the rest of the world by reneging on prior commitments, such as cutting in half the U.S. pledge for the Global Environment Facility, providing less than half of the $3 billion pledged to the Green Climate Fund, and withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. This is of particular concern given the administration has touted that tree planting, although it's a good idea, but that tree planting will solve our climate crisis. Given that climate change will impact almost every program funded by this bill, I frankly don't understand why the administration refuses to stand behind commitments or make investments that could harness the power of U.S. businesses to innovatively address this challenge. Further, by neglecting to contribute to the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program and the International Fund for Agricultural Development, this administration signals a fundamental lack of understanding about the importance of risk mitigation and preparedness. Just as the novel coronavirus has disrupted markets, shocks like droughts, floods, or invasive pests can wipe out crops and contribute to food price spikes that quickly create conditions for instability, violence, and migration. While we don't always know when these events will occur, we know there's an increasing likelihood they will become more frequent and severe due to climate change. When communities are prepared to mitigate the impact of such events, they are better able to prevent lasting effects that are costly and threaten our own security. Diligence and leadership matter. We must demonstrate that the U.S. is a strong, reliable partner, just as we must stand unwaveringly behind our commitment to promoting democratic values. I'm concerned about the Treasury Department's engagement in U.S. efforts to combat terrorist financing networks and enforce sanctions against rogue nations. While sanctions can be a valuable tool to mobilize governments to cease human rights violations and take democracy and rule of law seriously, the administration's approach is neither consistent nor effective. Not one of the dangers I have just outlined is positively addressed by your budget request. As chairwoman, I have every expectation that we will produce a bill that maximizes each taxpayer dollar while maintaining responsible investments with our multilateral partners. Again, I welcome you here. And before we move to your testimony, let me turn to Mr. Rogers, the ranking member, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Secretary Mnuchin. Welcome to our subcommittee. We appreciate you being here. Look forward to your presentation on Treasury's Fiscal 21 International Programs request. Your department is seeking $1.59 billion in the coming fiscal year for international programs. That's about 8% less than the fiscal year 2020 enacted level. Key elements of the funding request would go towards meeting the annual U.S. commitments to the international financial institutions, debt restructuring, and Treasury's Office of Technical Assistance. The decrease from the enacted level apparently is primarily due to a negotiated reduction in the pledge to the International Development Association of the World Bank Group. This outcome is part of a larger package of reforms that the U.S. has advanced at the World Bank. And I look forward to hearing how those initiatives more closely align the World Bank with U.S. national security, foreign policy, and economic priorities. In addition to such reforms, I hope you will address us this morning on your role in providing the highest level of oversight to these institutions. I'll get into more specifics during our question and answer period. Mr. Secretary, another topic that we'd like to hear about, of course, is China. As you know, our government has identified the renewal of great power competition as a defining feature of the 21st century. With respect to China, the United States has developed a whole-of-government approach to respond to Beijing's expanding global reach. For the Department of Treasury, this response must include countering China's authoritarian development with a more transparent and market-oriented model. I hope you'll address us on the elements of a comprehensive U.S. economic strategy toward China that offers a meaningful alternative to Beijing's predatory trade and infrastructure financing. Finally, I would be remiss if I didn't raise the issue of the day, the spread of COVID-19 from China to much of the rest of the world and its impact on the global economy. I hope you will speak to the ways in which the administration and Treasury are helping to mitigate the economic impact of this disease, both domestically and internationally. We appreciate your service to your country. Look forward to your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you. I will be calling on members based on seniority of the members that were present when the hearing was called to order. I will alternate between majority and minority. Each member is asked to keep their questions to within 5 minutes per round. Secretary Mnuchin, we will be happy to place your full testimony into the record. I know you have a hard stop of 12 noon, so if you would be kind enough to summarize your oral statement, I want to make sure we leave enough time to get to everyone's questions. But Secretary Mnuchin, please proceed as you desire. Thank you.
I'll be very brief, but first of all, thank you, Chairman Lowy, and thank you, Ranking Member Rogers, and the members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to be here with you today. I first just want to emphasize and note the administration, through the White House Task Force, is doing everything possible to address the risks associated with the virus. And while public health is our highest priority, I assure you that we are also working on economic programs to support hardworking Americans and businesses that are affected by the disruptions associated with the spread of the virus. We're also coordinating with international organizations and our counterparts. The 2021 budget makes clear that we prioritize some very important issues. We have $1.6 billion for international programs. I would just highlight approximately $1.5 billion for the MDBs, as well as $33 million for OTA and $78 million in relief for the heavily indebted poor countries. I also just want to apologize in advance. I normally wouldn't do this, but I may look at my cell phone a couple of times during the meeting, given that everything's going on. And Chairman Lowy, I also want to recognize and thank you for the previous work we were able to do together on the bipartisan spending bill. And I look forward to Congress working together to address these very important issues associated with the virus on a timely basis.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, and I know that our work together with the Speaker was really invaluable, and you offered such important contributions to the effort. So welcome today. 10-year Treasury yield fell to a record low due to fears about the novel coronavirus. There are concerns of its impact on economic growth. I think that's the understatement of this hearing. Mr. Secretary, how will this affect the economy at home and abroad? And are you coordinating with the State Department and USAID on how global economic upheaval due to the novel coronavirus could impact underdeveloped nations? Is there a way to mitigate the impact on U.S. business interests abroad? And by the way, I realize that you're right in the middle. So all these questions, I'm sure, are on your agenda. And if you could share with us some of your thoughts, both here and abroad, we'd be appreciative.
Well, let me just comment that the situation is obviously moving very quickly and rapidly. So we are literally meeting every single day, 7 days a week on this, on the task force. Steve Biegun from the State Department, the Deputy Secretary, is on the task force. I actually was meeting with Secretary Pompeo this morning, and we updated each other on the issues directly as well. So State and Treasury are very much coordinated. We have a large team at Treasury, both consisting of international and domestic people looking at these issues. We are coordinating on an international basis. We are the host of the G7, so we've been hosting both G7 calls. We've been having bilateral calls. We've had conversations with the IMF and the World Bank. We're also on a domestic basis in touch with all the regulators. I hosted a call yesterday of the President's Working Group, which included all the major regulators. So I assure you, we are not only focused on the health issues, but the economic issues and coordinating across the board on these.
Secretary Mnuchin, I just can't resist saying at the outset of this hearing that I appreciate your involvement. I know that you and the Speaker and I work closely on many issues as they've come forward. I appreciate you being here today. You should know as a member of the President's Cabinet that Secretary Pompeo doesn't feel he has any responsibility to come before this committee and other committees just to keep us abreast of what he's doing. So just thought I'd let you know as a member of the Cabinet. And again, we appreciate you being here today. Climate change. It's a threat to every investment made by this bill, from natural resources to food security and global health to peace building. Yet this administration has systematically withdrawn from activities to address climate change. Businesses here and abroad have experienced the negative impacts caused by rising seas, erratic weather patterns, lost productivity, and it makes it much more critical to uphold and strengthen our multilateral partnerships. The administration has justified cutting the United States pledge for the Global Environment Facility in half, suggesting that doing so will incentivize burden sharing among other donors. Mr. Secretary, given our lack of participation on climate change, do our multilateral partners believe we are even serious about tackling this problem?
Well, let me first say that the President very much cares about the environment, and specifically clean air and clean water. And we are doing everything both domestically and internationally from a technology standpoint and a policy standpoint to focus on clean air and clean water. I would just also comment, and I don't want to minimize the issue of climate change, but I was at Davos last month where the only thing people wanted to talk about was climate change, and it was a month ago I was emphasizing to people there are other very important issues, such as the health issues. I think people underestimated globally the impact of this when China was quarantining 12 million people. So I want to emphasize that we look at the environmental issues broadly, and this is one of the important international issues, but not the only important international issue.
I appreciate that, and I'd be interested to know, has the administration's approach to really beat up on other countries to do more, has he been successful in getting others to step up?
Well, I wouldn't use the word beat up. I would use the word encourage. And yes, the president believes in burden sharing. So whether it's other countries paying their fair share of NATO, or it's other countries paying their fair share for international organizations, or doing what they need to do. We've had specific conversations with both China and India as a result of environmental issues there, and the president is very focused on that.
Has their increased participation made up the gap from our retreated efforts? Because I understood that when you were saying he was trying to encourage greater participation, which is a good thing. But has the gap been made up?
I think in most cases it has, but I would also just emphasize it's not just the contributions of money, it's the policies. So the United States is the most advanced on clean energy. I think as you look at what we're doing on tax credits for carbon recapture and other ideas, I mean, technology is moving quickly, and we are looking at technology for efficient and clean energy.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers.
Mr. Secretary, let me ask you briefly about the economic impact. Obviously, we're experiencing some heavy interference in the normal business activity because of the virus. Should we be getting more help from international financial institutions like the World Bank? Should we not expect more out of them?
Well, let me just comment that, again, I think as you look at, there's no question that as a result of the virus, in many parts of industry, the economic actions are actually well in advance of what might be the health issues at this time. And there's no question as it relates to both domestic and international travel, it is down considerably. On an international basis, both the IMF and World Bank have committed significant resources. The IMF has made a commitment of $50 billion of loans. And again, let me just say, these are loans, not grants, so we're pleased with that. And the World Bank has announced about $12 billion, I think, which is split with about $6 billion of loans and $6 billion of grants. So I think it is important. Both these institutions, we have had conversations with the leadership, both bilaterally, again, as well as the leadership calls that they've hosted. So we are working with them closely.
What could you tell us about measures currently under consideration to stabilize the global economy, both at home and abroad? What do you need from us in that vein?
Well, I think, as you know, the president's major concern is focusing on the U.S. economy. So we do want to make sure we coordinate on an international basis, but our first concern is protecting the U.S. economy. The immediate issue, and we are working with the Speaker and Leader McConnell, and we urge Congress to pass legislation quickly. The first priority is funding that will go for small and medium-sized businesses that are directly impacted by this. There are a large number of workers that are going to be required to self-quarantine or be at home to take care of family members who are self-quarantined. For small and medium-sized businesses, we think it's appropriate for the government to pick up those costs. This is a little bit like a hurricane, and we need to cover these outside of normal expenses. We are also looking to increase SBA lending dramatically. We have a current program. We need more authorization for that program. We are also looking, and this we can do on an administrative basis, we don't need Congress, but we are looking at providing substantial relief to certain taxpayers and small businesses who will be able to get extensions on their taxes, and we think we can provide over $200 billion of liquidity into the economy by delaying certain tax payments. But we urge Congress to act quickly. The president very much wants to consider a stimulus bill, whether it's through a payroll tax or otherwise. We realize that may not get done this week, so we want to get done what we can do this week, and we will come back. I will also say there may be specific industries, and I want to be clear, this is not bailouts. We are not looking for bailouts, but there may be specific industries that are highly impacted by travel, that have issues with lending. And just like after September 11th, the government authorized certain loan guarantees, we may consider that. And I would just say, you know, the loan guarantees are a very effective way of making sure that the government is paid back without putting the government at risk.
I would assume that would include the airlines.
I would assume the airlines would be on the top of the list, but it would be, again, it may include other areas such as hotels, cruise lines, and others. And again, this is something we'll be working with industry and coming back to Congress. But the president feels very strongly that we need to protect industry, not bail out, but provide relief to small and medium-sized businesses, and whatever powers we need to make sure our airlines and our travel industry can get through this, we will.
This question is going to refer not necessarily to the monetary end, but the health fight. We're being told that large gatherings are to be not attended to avoid passing of the germs. We've got the National Basketball Association, NCAA tournament coming up with huge gatherings of fans all across the country. Do you anticipate that there would be a move to prevent the public from going to those ball games?
Well, let me comment first. I have enormous confidence in our professional health professionals. This is an area that I haven't previously spent anything like this period of time. I'm immersed on this in the committee, and whether it's the people at CDC, whether it's the people at NIH, whether the people at HHS, we have enormous expertise. This group is advising the task force and the vice president daily. This group is coming out with guidance to the states. I would say in general, most of these decisions will be decisions of the governors on a state-by-state basis, but we will be updating the guidance. We're meeting actually with the president today to give the president an update on guidance. I'm not going to answer your specific question, but I can tell you those are the types of things that the task force is reviewing. And again, I would say it is most likely going to be state-by-state recommendations. So this is not a one-size-fits-all approach necessarily.
Well, of course, these national associations that we're talking about are national programs like basketball, NCAA. It's not subject to local control. Governors don't control the NCAA, only national associations that I'm talking about. Do you anticipate that those national associations would come to some agreement to restrict the attendance of the public at these large sports events, for example?
I'm not trying to deflect your question. We are addressing these types of issues, and the task force will be making recommendations. As you've said, in certain cases, these will be governor decisions. In certain cases, they may be federal decisions. In certain cases, they're private decisions. So I can tell you, private companies, as I've said, have already reacted to pretty much canceling all large events. I can tell you, I saw in the news yesterday, Coachella in California is postponed till October. So again, I don't want to give you an answer to a specific event, but I can tell you these issues are being addressed and recommendations will be made by the task force.
Well, Mr. Secretary, we appreciate your work. This is tough. This is tough stuff you're going through. And none of us, especially you and the administration, have never been through this before. So we're in a new field here. But thank you for your service, and thank you for staying with it.
And again, thank you for saying that, and I want to acknowledge these are difficult issues, but I also want to just put this in perspective, as I've said before. Both on the economic side, when there was a financial crisis, people were concerned that was going to go on for years. This will not go on for years. I am highly confident, listening to the medical professionals, that the medical approaches will develop quickly in being able to address these. That, again, this is something we need to deal with for a period of time. And again, I want to just emphasize, for children, this is less harmful than the flu. For most young or middle-aged Americans, this will be similar to the flu, and that there are parts of our population that we are particularly focused on that are the elderly, particularly with other issues, that are having more impactful. But I want to emphasize to the committee and to the American public, we will get through this.
Thank you.
Thank you again. Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Good to see you. I would like to ask you a bit about Sudan. I visited Sudan a couple of months ago with Congresswoman Bass, bipartisan delegation, and we were cautiously optimistic about the progress of the new government. Now, I have to ask you these questions because Secretary Pompeo won't come, and I know some of this jurisdiction is probably within state, but I know you do have some jurisdiction with regard to terrorist financing and what have you. First of all, Sudan is on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. We were looking at should we deschedule or not. And we've introduced legislation asking to expedite this review process. One of the issues we learned when we were there was that it's very difficult to identify any terrorist financing because of sanctions and because of multilateral sanctions, and also because other countries are caught up in the United States, of course, sanctions as it relates to or as a result of state sponsor of terrorism. And so, again, I understand the State Department is responsible for delisting or descheduling if, in fact, that's going to happen. But I'd like to get your take on the sanctions, the multilateral sanctions, and the issue of terrorist financing, because I know that Mr. Marshall, is it Billingsley, was in Sudan this past weekend looking at this. And so how does all of this work with other countries and other multilateral organizations because of what the United States has not moved forward yet on?
Well, on sanctions broadly, we coordinate very, very closely with the State Department. Certain of the sanctions authorities are managed by the State Department in consultation with us, and certain are the other way around. But I assure you, we are very much coordinated. Secretary Pompeo and I have specifically talked about these sanctions. I will also tell you, I've spent an incredibly large amount of time with both the Foreign Minister of Sudan and the Water Minister of Sudan, because you may have seen in the press, at the President's request, I've been helping to negotiate an agreement between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan on their dam. And I feel that, first of all, let me just say, I think the government in Sudan is absolutely making the right improvements and working in the right direction. We like what they're doing. I would also say if we can reach an agreement on this dam, it will bring tremendous economic benefits to Sudan. The creation of electricity, as you know, there are many people in Sudan that do not have access to electricity. It'll also bring important economic help to the region. So I can't comment specifically on this, but I can tell you we are in direct discussions with the State Department on the sanctions.
But what I wanted to, though, drill down a bit on is in terms of terrorist financing. That's within your jurisdiction, right?
Yes.
And so I know that this is an impediment, having Sudan on the state-sponsored terrorism. How does that work with regard to our assessment of whether or not terrorist financing is taking place, as well as other countries and other multilateral institutions who, as a result of what we're doing, they have a problem also? So
we've given very direct input, both us and the State Department, to Sudan what they need to be doing. As you said, Marshall, who works for me, was there this week. So we've had very direct discussions. In this environment, obviously, in an open environment, I cannot go through the specifics with you, but we are in very direct conversations with the government there.
Okay, then I'd like to follow up with you, because I think based on what we learned and what we saw, we have a very short window to move forward in terms of supporting the new government of Sudan, or backward, we will see some backward turn in terms of where they're heading. On Iran, let me ask you about the maximum pressure campaign and the drastic implications it has on the Iranian people now in terms of just financing humanitarian imports, given that Iran has one of the highest numbers, actually, outside of China, is one of the epicenters for the COVID-19 virus. And so, yes, much of the blame is on the Iranian government, but reports indicate that sanctions really may inhibit now the importation of test kits and medical equipment and medical devices. So can you kind of let me know what is taking place in terms of direct assistance, maybe to Iran through a third country, or what is the status of this given the state of emergency?
Thank you. It's a very good question. So our sanction programs have always allowed for exceptions for humanitarian aid and medicine. And we've always made very clear our issues are not with the people of Iran. We want to make sure that they have access to that. Even before the virus, we started working on what we call the humanitarian channel with the Swiss. Last year, we were able to do the first transaction through that. And what that means is that countries or entities that want to provide humanitarian aid, in essence, if you go through this channel, OFAC will, in essence, provide a green light for that transaction. It's a heightened due diligence transaction. And we did that even before the virus, because we wanted to make very clear our issue was not with the people of Iran. I can tell you I've made very clear at the G7 and the G20, again, that channel is open, that people that want to, particularly as a result of the virus, contribute to Iran. We support the people of Iran. Our issue is with the government of Iran, and they're using the people's resources on nuclear development.
Okay, if we have a second go around, I have another question I'd like to ask you later. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And following up on your question, the fact that last week the Treasury Department decided to exempt humanitarian trade involving the Central Bank of Iran from economic sanctions in light of the coronavirus, how is Treasury planning to ensure that the Central Bank of Iran uses this humanitarian exception appropriately?
We'd be happy to follow up with your office because it's a long and technical answer. But the answer is we've put through on this Swiss channel what we call heightened due diligence. So it allows OFAC to have complete visibility to where the money is coming from, where the money is going to, and for us to make sure it's not diverted for illicit activity and things that should be sanctioned. But we'd be happy to follow up on a technical basis and explain that to your staff.
Thank you. That would be very helpful. Oh, I didn't see. Ms. Meng, I think you were next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, and thank you, Secretary, for being here today and for your leadership during this difficult time. Wanted to ask about a letter I wrote to you in December expressing concern about an American Muslim woman from New York City who used her Venmo account to pay for a meal at a Bangladeshi restaurant named Al Aqsa Restaurant. She was soon contacted by Venmo to ask for a full explanation of her transaction. And what we've been hearing is that this is part of a larger trend in which banks have closed, often without justification, credit and bank accounts of customers perceived as Muslim. And for an American Muslim or anyone to learn that their account, including identifying personal and financial information, has been flagged to OFAC based on simple search terms that implicate them in terrorist activities is unsettling. According to your office's response, and thank you for the response, OFAC encourages companies to use the specially designated nationals and blocked persons list to employ a risk-based approach to sanctions compliance, but does not mandate or require any specific screening regime or stipulate specific terms for financial institutions to use. So my question is, when a Venmo or PayPal account is flagged for the inadvertent use of a term that is on that SDN list, what personal information from that account, if any, does OFAC retain? And is that information used for any other purpose?
I actually do read the letters that you all send to me, so I want you to know that. I don't always remember every single letter, but I actually do remember your letter. My team just handed it to me, but I don't need to look at it because it was one of those letters that was very specific. And I do remember I inquired with our team about and saw our response. I don't know the exact answer to what you're describing because it's highly technical, but I'll ask my team to follow up. But I was assured when I reviewed this that this was not as a result of something that OFAC was doing.
Okay, sure. I would love to follow up because I think people are just very nervous. This was, in this case, a young girl, a woman who was just going out to eat at a restaurant with her local friends and was just trying to Venmo the money back to her friend to repay. And well, can I ask, will OFAC work with companies like Venmo to ensure that they're using smarter technology to contextualize transaction descriptions that might overlap these types of terms in order to avoid infringing on the privacy of users who are clearly not supporting terrorist organizations?
Yeah, let me just emphasize it's unfortunate of this specific situation, and when I looked into this, I want to make sure OFAC puts out guidelines, and I don't think anything in the OFAC guidelines is what caused this. We put out guidelines how people administer the BSA and the sanctions list. Obviously, we encourage companies to have different approaches, so I'm not sure it's OFAC's job to go out and fix every single company's issues, but I assure you there's nothing in OFAC's guidelines that we think would encourage this type of behavior, and as I said, we'll follow up with you more on the specifics.
Thank you, I appreciate that. My other question is coronavirus related. I know that you've been named as a member of the President's Coronavirus Task Force. Wanted to ask about comments. Last week, Leah Gabriel, the coordinator of the Global Engagement Center, warned that Russia is coordinating millions of online false personas that seek to spread misinformation about the virus. What is the task force doing to combat this and to ensure that accurate information about this pandemic is the prevailing online narrative? Concerned that the president's comments, which have gone against CDC guidance that coronavirus isn't really dangerous, that people with minimal symptoms should continue to go to work, that those comments would feed into this Russian propaganda threat.
I don't think that the president's comments are inconsistent with the guidance. What I would say is that this situation is evolving very, very quickly, and the
Sorry,
task force
Secretary.
guidance-
He's made comments that people with coronavirus could and should continue to go to work, and that the coronavirus isn't really dangerous.
I don't believe he said that people with the coronavirus should go to work. I think what he said was that for most people, okay, that they can go about their business, that the coronavirus, okay, that the risk for most people getting it is very low, and if someone gets it, it's very low. That is still true. Having said that, our guidance is now more specific. There are areas of the country where the guidance has changed, and again, this guidance has been reviewed with the president, and he agrees with that. It's now much more specific. And as it relates to the first part of your question, I'm not familiar with that, but I don't consider that to be the task force responsibility, but I can assure you the intel community looks at those types of things. Again, I'm not familiar with it and can't opine on it, but what you're referring to sounds more like an Intel community issue than a task force issue.
My time is up. Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Frankel. Ms. Frankel.
Good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, sir, for being here. I want to pick up on some of the coronavirus questions. So what industries do you expect are going to be hardest hit?
I think at this point, it's clear that the travel industry in particular is going to be the hardest hit. That what we're seeing is that similar to after 9/11, there was a big impact on airline travel. Unlike a recession where airlines lower the price of tickets and more people fly, this obviously we just have a complete decrease in volume. So as I said earlier, there may be needs to come back to Congress like we did after September 11th. And again, I don't want to, this is not a bailout. This is considering providing certain things for certain industries. So I would say travel, airlines, hotels, cruise lines, I believe are the areas that are impacted. But again, our focus is also on small and medium-sized businesses that are particularly associated with these industries. There are many industries that will go on fine. Many industries can telecommute very easily. Many areas of the country still don't have cases or have very few cases. So again, this is something we're going to have to look at very specifically.
I'm sorry, Madam Chair, if I'm repeating some questions that were asked, but what are some of the ideas that you're circulating in terms to help these industries?
Right now, our focus, and again, I would kind of, say this is the first and second inning. Right now, we are working with Congress on making sure that we can reimburse workers who have to be home on sick leave, okay? And many times they're quarantined for 2 weeks. They may or may not even be sick. They may have been in contact with someone who's sick.
So excuse me, just to reclaim. So that would be something like paid family leave. That is something, I'm assuming that's something, I know I've heard the president mention. Is that something that's on your list of?
It is, and I've spoken to the president and the speaker and others about that, and that's what's being worked on immediately.
And what would be the form of the payment in the plan that you're working on? Where would the money come from?
Well, the money would come from the federal government. We're actively looking at how we disperse it. There's alternative mechanisms that we're exploring how we can most effectively. But this would be the federal government reimbursing companies so that they could pay the workers, and whether the money goes direct to the workers or the money goes to the companies to the workers, we're figuring out the most efficient way.
Well, let's just make sure that, first of all, I think this is a good thing to be looking at paid family leave. I just want to make sure that the workers actually get it, which gets me to the next. There had been some talk about a payroll tax cut, and I had a question relative to that, because I think, this sounds sort of, well, let me just ask a question. A payroll tax cut could actually encourage someone who is sick to come to work.
No, I don't see that it's the case at all.
I mean, okay, let me ask the question a different way, because I want to be fair here. What do you think a payroll tax cut would do in this environment?
Okay, there's two ways of dealing with the issue. One is dealing with very specific issues, as I've just said. A person is in home quarantine, they're not even sick, they're in home quarantine because they randomly came in contact with someone, they work for a small business, they don't get covered. We think those people should be covered. That is very direct. So
covered by what?
The federal government should make sure those people get paid for those 2 weeks.
Okay, that's okay.
So there are some very specific things.
I could agree with that.
Okay. As it relates to, there are other issues where the entire economy is slowing down. Again, only because, not because of a specific issue that anybody's sick, because every company in the U.S. right now is stopping travel, stopping meetings, and everything else. That has impacts on restaurants, hotels, everything.
I understand that, but let's get to the payroll
So
tax
the
cut.
payroll
How
tax
would that
cut,
help?
the payroll tax cut is a stimulus mechanism of putting money into the economy. Okay,
Is that by,
stimulate the
I'm
economy.
sorry to interrupt you. That's by puts money into the individual workers' pockets, is that correct?
correct,
Okay,
and that-
so, if, I'm just putting this out there and asking this question. Do you have to come to work or not? Do you have to come to work to earn the money for the payroll tax cut, or are you thinking of a scheme where you were going to get that money regardless of whether you come to work?
I don't like the word scheme, program.
Program.
Again, let me just say, there's two different things, and I want to emphasize this, and it's an important issue to understand.
Yes,
So
okay.
I want to emphasize this.
Thank you.
One is, there are people who we are encouraging not to come to work, okay? Because based upon state guidance and CDC guidance, those people should be in self-quarantine, okay? We don't want to penalize those people from not getting paid if their company is not covering it.
Correct.
JP Morgan and the big banks are covering it. We don't need to
So you want to
reimburse
give them some money back, and what, Madam, I'm sorry to keep, if I could
I
just
want to
continue.
make sure that those hardworking Americans get paid for the 2 weeks.
And how will that
they're home.
happen? What are the ideas for that?
I've just said to you, there's two ways of distributing the money. One is directly to that person in the form of a debit card or a direct deposit. The other is making sure that the companies continue to make those payments and that the company will be reimbursed. The only difference is we're just trying to figure out very quickly, mechanically, how we can do it. It's
Okay, but that's not a
philosophical issue.
payroll tax cut.
That's not. The payroll tax cut has nothing to do with whether you're home sick. The payroll tax cut is money. It's an efficient way of getting money to all the hardworking Americans.
But you have to come to work to earn that money, correct?
Let me be clear, okay? If you're home because you're in a sick situation, you would get that money as well. That money would go, that money goes to everybody across the board to stimulate the economy. So it doesn't in any way encourage you, you have to work or you don't have to work. It's completely independent.
All right, yeah, I think I've used up my time. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you for being here with us once again. I want to continue on a little bit, just because I think it's really important. Constituents that I represent, don't get to have an audience with you, so that's my job to do. China shut down a lot of its shipments into the Port of LA and Long Beach. My constituents work when shipments are coming in or leaving to those locations. So let's just take Amazon as an example. There are employees that work directly for Amazon. I assume those employees will be taken care of. But there are contractors that do data entry for Amazon, whose contracts have already been canceled. Many of them are independent folks, gig workers, such as Uber drivers, are already being impacted because, as you stated, there are cancellations of conferences and different things. As an example, coming here on Sunday night from Dallas to DC. My Uber driver worked 12 hours on Saturday night, and he earned $60. So this is not someone who's just sitting at home waiting, to be called back, to be returned to work. It's simply there is no work out there for them. I want you to think about it from the perspective of when the bottom fell out of the housing market. We want to make sure that we are protecting people that need to pay rent, that need to pay their mortgage. And I want to applaud the effort that you have talked about to temporarily halt payments to the IRS that are due April 15th. That is a good step, in the right direction. But I want to make sure that while we're looking to, and I know you don't want to use bailout, but while we're looking to assist the airline industry and major cruise airlines, I'm not going to vote for a bill that comes before me that does not include, the poor working people that I represent or the people that I come across every single day. I just want to make sure that you understand that. That is, going to be what I'm looking at very, very closely.
I appreciate that, and let me just emphasize, that is also the President's #1 concern.
Thank you.
As I said, I want to emphasize it is critical that Congress act quickly. this isn't going to be the first time. I mean, this isn't going to be the last time we do this. So we want to get something done quickly, but I can assure you, we're going to be back 1, 2, 3, 4. The hardworking people, small and medium-sized independent people that are directly impacted by this, okay? That's where we need to provide economic support. And the President and I agree with you 100%. I've addressed people who may be home because they're sick. There are also areas, as you said, where kind of having no fault of theirs because travel has shut down, all these other people that work around these industries will need to be helped.
If you know, it's also my job to ensure that you're addressing public corruption in the Northern Triangle, so I want to discuss OTA, what OTA has done in Central America. Migrants continue to come north. You know, the government in Honduras is, you know, maxed out on corruption. I don't know that there's been an envelope that hasn't been given to the president that he has not accepted in cash payments. So in your 2019 project report, we saw that OTA engaged with Guatemala and Honduras, but not on issues of economic crime. Whereas OTA work with other countries on money laundering and anti-corruption measures. Is OTA, you know, work really interested in dealing with the root causes of migration in Central America?
I think they are, and I think OTA provides very important resources, and we appreciate the committee funding it. And as the specifics of what you're talking about, we're happy to follow up with your office.
You know, you're asking for an increase, $33 million in fiscal year 21. So what kinds of programs does OTA plan to use that funding for? And would OTA look into using this funding to increase the work within the Northern Triangle, including Panama? You know, we talked about a lot of letters that, you know, come to your desk. You know, I wrote a letter in November of 2017. The NGO Global Witness alleged that there was drug trafficking and money laundering that occurred that might have involved the Trump Ocean Club Panama. I still haven't heard anything on that. So, you know, I want to make sure that we are focused. If you are asking for an increase, that increase is going to be to deal with crimes of public corruption and drug trafficking as it relates to money laundering.
I agree, and we'll follow up with you.
Thank you. I yield back.
My friends, I think we'll do another round, although, Mr. Rogers, you are sitting there lonely. I'll ask a question, then I'll turn it over to you. One of my favorite issues, not because they're so successful, but I keep trying to get information and hope they will be successful, and that's the Office of Technical Assistance. The Office of Technical Assistance often sends technical advisors to work alongside officials in host countries for an extended length of time in order to help improve their capacity to manage public finances. I'd be interested to know if there are partnerships that have worked according to your standard. Are they achieving the intended objectives? How does this support help keep countries from falling into debt traps? And how does it decide where to engage? For example, your office, this office, I believe, was involved in Afghanistan when Ashraf Ghani took control. Many of us had great hopes for Ashraf Ghani because of his prior work experience. Just as an example, if you could discuss that or any other area where perhaps you can share some successes of this office. I see your smile.
I'm smiling because Afghanistan is obviously a complicated situation.
You can use other examples of this office.
I'm sorry, this office is OTA, or this was the?
It's the Office of Technical Assistance.
Yeah, so I think there's really in many places, let me just check with. I think again, we had a question earlier on the Northern Triangle, but El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, I know there's countries in Africa. I know there's really, this has been a project where I really think it's been successful all over the world, and the real issue for us is it's only $33 million, and we have to figure out how we limit our resources, because I constantly have countries who ask us for technical assistance. So whether it's around raising revenues or other issues, this is, we've asked for a small increase, but this is something that we think is well paid for.
I would appreciate it. To me, this is one of the most important functions. And I would appreciate following up with you if there are examples of success. How did it work? What happened? Northern Triangle was another story. This committee was pretty outraged. The government, our government, just held up the money for 6 months.
I understand.
Never sent the money over there. I don't know if you had anything to do with it, but if you did, I'd love you to have the opportunity to tell me about it.
I had no involvement in it. And let me just make, I think I made a comment earlier, and somebody in the room must have picked up. I was referring to our #1 economic priority was on small and medium-sized businesses. Someone interpreted that, I think incorrectly in the room back there. Our #1 priority is obviously protecting health and human life. I was only referring to the economic issues, but.
But in any event, I would like to follow up on OTA, and I think it would be helpful for us. Oh, my goodness, isn't that good? Did your staff giving you some additional information?
What we're going to do is I'll send you a report that you can distribute to the committee that has a full analysis of, over the last year, these are the countries we've provided assistance, and this is what we've done, so there's complete transparency, and the committee can understand that.
And in fact, it doesn't have a huge amount of funds, but these services, in my judgment, have been desperately needed in so many parts of the world. And it would be very good if, in fact, you can give us examples of success and where we can use these principles.
We will absolutely do that. And, I'm known as a micromanager, but this is something that is actually even below my radar, so we'll provide you the report.
I'm known as a micromanager too, but I really don't know of examples of success there, so I thank you. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, as you know, China's Belt and Road Initiative has both undermined U.S. influence and brought with it a wide range of problems associated with corruption and debt burdens. Many have focused on the new U.S. Development Finance Corporation as the principal means by which the U.S. can counter China's lending model. While the DFC is an important tool, we need everyone working toward this effort in a concerted way. In this regard, how can Treasury help shape the rules of the road and bring greater transparency to China's opaque practices abroad?
As you mentioned, the U.S. Development Finance Corp, it is one of our tools, but that's just one of our tools. And we're very focused, both at the IMF and the World Bank, on debt transparency. We think this is critically important. And in certain programs, we've required in these institutions for the countries to get the programs renewed that we had complete debt transparency is related to loans with Belt and Road in China. And I want to be perfectly clear, we're not using, and we're not ever going to be using, money from these international organizations to pay back China.
How do you see the role of the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank countering the China model in the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, I think the World Bank in particular is incredibly important, and this has been a great institution, post-war institution. The U.S. has shown great leadership. We're very pleased that David Malpass, who used to work for me at Treasury, is now leading the organization. He's been moving forward many reforms, and we think that it's a great source of funds to countries that need it.
Switching subjects. Mr. Secretary, last year, as we hosted the 8th Annual National Prescription Drug Abuse and Heroin Summit in Atlanta, at which the President and First Lady attended. And by the way, the 9th edition of that summit is coming up in early April, becoming now the premier place for the discussion of opioid research. I know combating the flow of fentanyl and other opioids into the U.S. has been a top priority of this administration, and we thank you for that. I'm cautiously optimistic that we are making some progress with China on the fentanyl and other opioid issues, and I hope you agree. I know that Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control has used the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Act to target the assets of Chinese fentanyl traffickers. What can you tell us about this effort and the efforts of the men and women working on issues of terrorism and financial intelligence to help break these trafficking networks?
Thank you. I think this is an issue that's very important to the president. As you know, China has made significant progress. That's a result of, at one of our summits, President Trump specifically asked President Xi to change the laws, which he agreed to do and has been working with us. Notwithstanding that, there are times where there are things going on that they even can't control, and OFAC will use its tools, as you've identified, to do whatever we can to stop illicit activities.
Well, the experts tell us that within the world of opioids and lookalikes, that fentanyl is by far the most deadly and the one most difficult to stop. So I appreciate the work that you're doing and the administration in fighting this fight. It's way from over. We need to keep more pressure on the Chinese because that's where all of the fentanyl is coming from. It's not just a piece of the world, it is the world of fentanyl. Can we ask you to keep up the good work? Madam Chair, I yield back. Thank you, sir.
Ms. Lee?
Thank you very much. Okay, Mr. Secretary, let me ask you a couple of questions. One is, you're on the interagency task force, right, as it relates to COVID-19?
Yes, the White House task force.
Yeah, okay, White House task force, excuse me. I asked Dr. Redfin yesterday about this. Every committee hearing I'm attending, I'm asking so I can wrap my hands around what's going on as it relates to hand sanitizers. And Dr. Redfin said yesterday it was the White House task force that was looking at this or responsible for it. CDC did not know. The lack of availability. First of all, when you look at the directives from CDC and our health agencies, the directives are in terms of prevention of the transmission or contracting the virus, is washing one's hands at least 20 times. But secondly, if that's not available, and a lot of places don't have clean water, use the hand sanitizers. Well, first of all, if you can't find the hand sanitizers, and you know, I've been in 3 cities in the last 7 days, none. There are no hand sanitizers available. What does one do? I started looking and doing some research and found that now people are making their own using alcohol and aloe vera. I guess sooner or later alcohol will not be available. What is the task force doing in terms of the supply chain and the directives for people in terms of their health? The public health directives are useless if, in fact, you can't find hand sanitizers. And Dr. Redfin said the task force is responsible for this.
First of all, let me say thank you for raising the topic. I think on the hand washing, I just want to clarify, I'm not 100% sure, but I think you're supposed to wash your hands for 20 seconds.
I mean, what did I say, 20 minutes?
20 times. So
20 times, 20 seconds, excuse me.
I just wanted to, for everybody's benefit,
20 seconds.
Clarify that. It may end up being you wash your hands 20 times a day as well.
or more.
Specifically, I will follow up on this. The answer is we have the task force. There are then subcommittees of the task force. I'm sure somebody's looking at this. I will follow up.
I hope so, but no one has been able to answer, and I'm getting ready to go to ag, and I understand FDA now is the
We're having a
authority.
committee meeting this afternoon. I assure you I will address it.
You will do that, and would you let us know the response right away, because people are becoming very concerned about this. The second question I have is just going back to Iran and secondary sanctions. If banks can't purchase humanitarian supplies, medical supplies, how are what we're doing allowing these supplies to be distributed in Iran, given the emergency? So how do secondary sanctions weigh in
Both
this?
primary sanctions and secondary sanctions, there are exemptions for humanitarian transactions. So banks are able to participate. And again, these transactions need to be properly vetted.
Sure.
And the reason why we set up the Swiss channel, but the answer is in the case of this channel, obviously banks are involved. And again, if you go through the Swiss channel, effectively you get a good housekeeping seal of approval, and the bank doesn't have risk for that transaction. So
Okay.
that's why we wanted to facilitate that.
Thank you very much.
Secretary Mnuchin, I know how busy you are. I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for appearing before us. And this concludes today's hearing. Where is it?
Thank you for letting me out early.
I was looking for my place to conclude the hearing. The Subcommittee on State Foreign Operation Related Program stands adjourned. Thank you so much for being here today.